Most people look at BYD and see a car company that makes a lot of its own parts. That is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happens to the economics of the business when you control those parts yourself, because BYD isn't just trying to make a cheaper battery, a cheaper motor, or a cheaper car. It is trying to make the whole system cheaper and faster at the same time, and that is much harder for a competitor to copy. So in the next few minutes, I want to show you where that advantage actually comes from. Not from a slogan, from the numbers, from the supply chain, and from something most people miss completely: how quickly a company can learn from one car and put that lesson into the next one. Then I'll pin a correction. If you've spent any time around manufacturing, you already know the basic problem. A traditional automaker doesn't really build a car by itself. It coordinates one. The battery comes from one company, power electronics from another. Motors, sensors, electronics, modules, and hundreds of other components come from a network of suppliers. That model works. In fact, it worked for decades. You don't need to own every factory to build a great product, but there is a price. Every time you depend on somebody else for something important, you add another conversation to the business, another contract, another engineering team, and when you want to change something, all those conversations start again. That is where BYD made a different bet. It brought many of the important pieces closer to home: batteries, motors, power electronics, semiconductors, vehicle platforms, and increasingly, software and intelligent driving technology. BYD's 2024 annual report reported about RMB 54.2 billion in R&D spending and more than 120,000 R&D employees. That is a staggering number, but don't stop there. The real question is what the company gets back for that spending. Imagine you're running an automaker. Your battery supplier tells you that changing the battery pack will require another 6 months of engineering work. And imagine your battery supplier tells you that changing the battery pack will require another 6 months of engineering work. Your chassis team says the change affects vehicle weight. Your software team needs to recalibrate the system. Your manufacturing plant needs new equipment. And your purchasing department has to renegotiate the contract. Nobody is doing anything wrong. That is just how a complicated supply chain works. But every one of those handoffs costs time. BYD has spent years moving some of those decisions inside the same organization. Now the battery engineer can sit closer to the vehicle engineer. The manufacturing engineer can sit closer to both. A change that might have required several companies to coordinate can sometimes be handled inside one system. That is not a management theory. It is a practical manufacturing advantage, and it shows up in the economics. Here is the part I think gets misunderstood. People say vertical integration means BYD makes everything itself. It doesn't, and it shouldn't. The smart question isn't, do you own the supplier? The smart question is, does this component have a big enough impact on cost, performance, or product development that we should control it? That is a very different question. If a component is cheap, standardized, and easy to source, owning the factory may be a terrible use of capital. But if that component determines how the entire vehicle performs, how quickly you can change the design, or how much the car costs to build, now the calculation changes. That is where BYD has been unusually aggressive. And this is where scale starts doing some serious work. BYD sold roughly 4.6 million new energy vehicles in 2025. Think about what that means inside a manufacturing company. Every vehicle is another production cycle, another battery, another motor, another set of electronics, another set of manufacturing data, another opportunity to find something that can be made cheaper, faster, lighter, or more reliably. When you sell a few 100,000 vehicles, those improvements are spread across a relatively small base. When you're producing millions, a small improvement can become real money. And the same thing happens with R&D. BYD reported roughly RMB 63.4 billion in R&D investment in 2025. Divide that very roughly across 4.6 million new energy vehicles, and you're looking at around RMB 13,800 of R&D investment per volt vehicle. That is not BYD's reported cost per car. It is simply a way to see the scale of the machine. The company can spend enormous amounts on engineering because millions of vehicles are there to absorb the cost. That is the part smaller competitors can't easily reproduce. But there is another advantage, and honestly, I think this one matters even more: speed. In manufacturing, speed isn't just about getting a product to market sooner. It is about how many times you get to try, change the design, build it, test it, find the problem, change it again, build it again. That is how manufacturing companies get good. And China's industrially fast and makes this process unusually fast in many categories: battery suppliers, shops, mold makers, testing equipment, logistics, engineering talent. They're not sitting in isolated islands, they're part of a dense manufacturing network. So when a factory engineer finds a problem, the next conversation might not be with someone halfway around the world. The supplier that can solve it may be much closer. That saves time. And in a business where products change every year, sometimes months of saved engineering time are worth more than a few percentage points of labor cost. That is the part of China's supply chain advantage that gets missed when people reduce the story to cheap manufacturing. It is not just cheap, it is dense, and density creates speed. Now let's put the BYD story under some pressure, because here is where I don't buy the easy version. If vertical integration automatically created huge profits, BYD's margins would keep getting better forever. They don't. In 2025, BYD's revenue rose to roughly RMB 804 billion from about RMB 777 billion in 2024, but gross profit fell from roughly RMB 151 billion to RMB 143 billion. Because it tells us what vertical integration doesn't do. It doesn't eliminate competition, it doesn't give you unlimited pricing power, and it doesn't guarantee higher margins every year. What it does is give you more control over the cost structure. When the market gets aggressive on price, that control becomes valuable. You have more places inside the system where you can find savings. You can redesign a component, change the manufacturing process, simplify the vehicle, adjust the battery, improve the yield, reduce waste. Those decisions are much harder when every important change has to be negotiated across 5 different companies. That is the real protection vertical integration can provide. Not magic, just more levers. And this is why I don't think BYD's competitive advantage should be described simply as vertical integration. That is too easy. The real advantage is the combination of 3 things. Control, scale, learning speed. Control gives BYD more influence over the cost and design of critical components. Scale spreads the cost of engineering and factory. And learning speed means the company can take what it discovers today and use it in the next product. Those 3 reinforce each other. More vehicles create more data creates more engineering opportunities, more engineering capability makes vertical integration more valuable, and more scale makes the whole system easier to pay for. That is a very different business model from simply buying parts from the cheapest supplier. So could another automaker copy BYD? Sure, it can build a battery plant, it can hire engineers, it can invest billions. But here's the problem. You can't buy 20 years of accumulated manufacturing experience on Monday morning. You can't instantly recreate the supplier network around you, and you can't manufacture millions of historical vehicle production cycles just by writing a bigger check. That is why copying the factories isn't enough. You have to copy the learning system, and that takes time. Here's a lesson here that goes well beyond electric vehicles. If you're running a technology company, a manufacturing business, or looking at an industrial investment, don't start by asking how much of the supply chain does this company own. That is the wrong question. Ask something much more practical. Which parts of the supply chain determine my cost, my product, and how quickly I can improve? Those are the parts worth controlling. Everything else can be bought, because vertical integration can be a terrible business decision if you integrate the wrong things. You take a supplier's variable cost and turn it into your fixed cost. You buy factories you don't need, you hire people you don't need, and suddenly your strategic advantage is sitting on your balance sheet waiting to become a problem. BYD's story is interesting for the opposite reason. It has spent years bringing control into the parts of the system that matter most to the final product. That is why the math works differently at scale. The factory becomes part of the engineering process. The supply chain becomes part of the product. And the cars already on the road become part of the learning process. That is the hidden math. BYD didn't win simply because it decided to make more parts itself. It built a system where manufacturing, engineering, supply chain, and product learning reinforce one another. Once that system reaches millions of vehicles, a competitor isn't just competing against BYD's next car, it is competing against everything BYD has already learned from the cars before it, and that is a much harder thing to copy.